Well, it was 2 weeks ago today that I sent away files to National Balsa to have them cut parts for me for the Oceanic, and today they arrived. So now I can get busy building this thing. So the box arrived from National Balsa and the parts looked pretty good. I spent a bit of time cleaning up the mess these peanuts made, but other than that, I was pretty happy with the result. These are the bulkheads, stacked up with the stern of the ship on the left and the bow on the right. These are the decks, and the sides of the ship, including the pattern for the portholes and the doors that are just etched into the surface. There are two things I wish I knew when I ordered this stuff from National Balsa. The first is that 1/4 inch plywood isn't 1/4 inch, it's 0.23 inches, and that leaves for a little bit of slop in the parts. I can shim this so it's not going to be a problem. The other thing is that 12-inch wide pieces of basswood are glued together from narrower pieces. So I should have just drawn this on narrower pieces of wood and saved some money. Another problem is that it leaves a glue line in the part. Sometimes if the glue is harder or softer than the wood, it doesn't sand well, so I may not be able to use these parts. But I haven't determined that yet. Now is a good time to add some mounting points in the keel. I'm going to use 1/4-20 T-nuts that are put into these slots that were laser cut out. They were part of the drawing that I had originally submitted. But it's not very strong, so we have to put some blocks around it. You want a good strong base for this to be screwed to. This is going to be a big model, so I'm going to put 5 mounting points in the bottom of the keel. That gives us some flexibility to have 5, 3, or 2 mounting pedestals supporting the model. Before planking, you have to bevel the bulkheads at the bow and the stern so that you've got a smoother section of bulkhead to glue the planking down to. In this case, I also have to bevel the bow because there's a very sharp entry at the front of the ship. This kind of work is best done with a very light touch and a high speed on the Dremel tool. Plywood is nice to work with because it has layers, and when the pattern on both sides are the same, you know that your work is symmetrical. I'm going to pre-form the wood by soaking it and then clamping it in place on the hull and letting it dry overnight. I'm holding the planks in place with these little clamps that I've made. It's 2 hooks made out of electrical wire and held together with a rubber band. You hook it around the hull and it holds the plank in place. And if you need a little bit more pressure at a certain point, you can put a piece of wood underneath the elastic and it will press down right where you want it. If you submerge basswood and then let it float to the top of the water, the portion of the wood touching the water will swell more, so it will curve in a certain direction. You can use this to help you pre-form the wood before attaching it to the hull. And after drying, this is what it looks like. It's properly curved to the shape of the hull, and it will take very little force to hold it against the bulkheads while the glue dries. And this is the point of no return. The planking is glued down to the bulkheads. One thing that's important when doing this kind of thing is always to make sure that the hull is straight. Sometimes if you plank one side and not the other side, or you put some tension on it, it will pull it out of alignment. And this is what it looks like with the porthole planking applied. This small gap between the sections of planking is not going to be a problem. I'm going to be covering this thing with fiberglass in the end, and I can fill this space with a little bit of filler. For the more curved part of the hull, I cut the planks narrower, but of the same thickness as the porthole sections. These are also soaked, but they're not pre-formed, they're just glued into place on the hull. As you can see, a lot of the planks don't go from stem to stern. They end up with a herringbone pattern. That's because the planks themselves don't curve in their long dimension. And if you try and force them to, they end up buckling like this and they never lay flat on the hull. But the basic idea is just to have the plank lay nicely on the bulkhead so it's not bent in the wrong direction. Once you've determined the natural run of the planking, you'd mark off where you want to cut it. So put this right to the end where the two previous planks meet and mark it. Then, using several light strokes of the X-Acto knife, cut off the piece you had marked. Always use several light strokes rather than one heavy stroke of the hobby knife. This hull is going to be filled, sanded, and painted, but it's still nice to have minimum gaps in between the planks. If you press it into place, this should hold it with friction well enough that you can move to the other side to mark it at the proper length. When I cut this, I'm going to cut it a little bit longer than it needs to be. But it's very close. So when I press it into place at the other end of the planking run, I can pull it back and see if the angle that I cut is proper. As we can see here, it needs a little bit taken off. But this time I cut it too short. That would normally mean the plank is spoiled, but remember how we plank these things symmetrically? Before I started cutting this, I looked to see which was the longer side, and I started cutting the longer side in case I did make a mistake like this, and then I can recut that piece for the shorter side and not waste an entire plank. And this takes a long time. If you put 2 or 4 planks on in a day and let them dry, you're doing pretty good. When I had originally taken this project, I looked at photographs of the real subject and I figured I know how to do that, and I looked at different parts and I thought I can do this and I know how to do that. I can figure out how to do this. But there's one section that I had no idea how to do, and that's the stern. It's a very smooth and flowing shape with openings in it, and it's got to be hollowed out, and that's very difficult to do. I had originally left these lines so that I could plank over top of this and then break the top of the bulkheads off and leave a hollow shell underneath. But I'm thinking that with the curvature of the stern, it is not going to work as well as I had hoped. So what I'm planning now is to break these off first and put balsa blocks in here and sand the whole thing into a nice shape. Then I'll wrap the balsa blocks in saran wrap and reinstall them in here and fiberglass over top of the whole thing. That way I can pull those balsa plugs out of there and it will leave a fiberglass shell. So these 2 balsa blocks are glued into the hull, and you can see that they're quite oversized. They'll need a lot of sanding to make them smooth with the rest of the hull. I'm going to use this sandpaper that's glued onto a piece of wood that is left smooth on one side so that the sanding can be focused where I want it and it won't scratch up the hull where the portholes are. You'll notice there's marker in the areas that I'm sanding. I put marker in the depressions so that as I'm sanding I can watch the marker, and when it disappears that means the surface has been sanded smooth. Since this is a curved surface, I always move the sandpaper around in a circular motion. Never sand too much in one place. moment ago I mentioned sanding in a circular motion. This works too, sanding in a rocking motion. The point is never stop in one place and sand a flat onto a curved surface. Notice that I'm not sanding too far over the edge at the bow. I'm not using a lot of pressure either. This is to avoid sanding too much material off the edge of the bow, and instead of making a nice flat surface with a sharp corner, it'll make a curve. The hull is pretty smooth, but there are still some high spots, and I can feel these better with my fingers than by eye. So I'm putting marks where the high spots are, and then I'm going to sand the marks away. Since we're here, it's probably a good time to start shaping the bow. I have to put a piece here that will fill in this little bulb that you see on the plans near the bottom of the hull. But towards the top, it's more of a rounded shape with a very sharp cutwater right at the waterline. Here I've glued some blocks of wood to the front, and I'm carving it and sanding it to the rough shape. The ends of the planking are quite jagged, as you can see here, and it's not going to make a nice sharp entry where the waterline is. So I cut that section out and I'll replace it with a block that can be carved into shape. I mixed black paint into the glue that's holding these two blocks together. That way, as I'm carving the cutwater, I can always tell where the center line of the ship is. You have to be careful when sanding the edge of a block like this. Due to the rotation of the drum, it wants to grab the edge and mangle the surface that you've already sanded. So I have my finger here kind of holding my hand in place to brace against that force. And it also helps to use a very light touch on the sander. As I'm sanding, I can see that black marker line disappear. So I know exactly when the two pieces of wood are flush. I could also see if I had sanded past the center line of the ship because of that black glue I put between the blocks. And as you approach the final shape, you work very slowly and methodically, and constantly look back and forth between the model and the plan. And do the final finishing and shaping with a sanding sponge. Once you're pretty happy with the shape and smoothness of the hull, you can cover it all with drywall mud to fill in any cracks there might be between the planks. You'll see that I've protected the portholes and the door markings with masking tape so they don't get full of mud. Spraying it with water moistens the mud and makes it easier to smooth. And after this was dry, I did some more sanding. But I'm sure you've seen enough sanding. I built up that area at the stern that was going to be hollow with styrofoam blocks. They had to be removable after it's been fibreglassed, so I held them on with clamps that hold it to the framing. And more sanding that you don't have to watch. And again, after it's been sanded, you can run your hands across the surface and you can feel if there are any bumps or hollows that you need to fill in or sand down. It may look a little weird, but it works. And this is where I think I'm going to leave it. Next time I'll do some fiberglass, possibly paint the bottom of the hull, and maybe even get into the superstructure. So I hope to see you back.